Welcome to your daily discussions with Dina. This is a grown folk conversation. So if you lack the ability to construct, respond to, or accept others' views without derision, kindly egress from adult dialogue. Thank you. Now, on February 21st of this year, comedian Kevin Hart was scheduled to perform a comedy show in Cairo. Now, it was all a part of his international tour. Unfortunately, there was later an official statement made by Egyptian event organizers. It's called Our Productions. And it said that the show had been canceled. And it was mentioned that it was canceled due to local logistical issues. Yeah, right. Interesting enough, many people questioned these local logistical issues and professed that in fact the logistical issues turned out to be nothing more than anti-black racism. Here's the thing. The current occupants of Egypt, those whom refer to themselves as Egyptians today, like to claim that black people from America are trying to steal their identity. And they like to say that black people from other places too are trying to claim or make their African country of Egypt Afrocentric. Afrocentric is a word that they like to use when they speak. It's almost like it's a negative. There was common speculation that these so-called Egyptians took offense to what Kevin Hart reportedly said about the black history of Egypt, and that it is what actually prompted the cancellation of his comedy show. How petty is that? Now, what I hear when these so-called Egyptians, or shall I say, those whom we refer to as Egyptians today speak, is that they dislike the word Afrocentric when referring to Egypt or Egyptians. And as you listen to them speak, you understand that in their minds, they separate themselves from the African continent itself, which they live upon, and even deny that Egypt is in fact a part of the continent of Africa. I always say, and I emphasize it, that Egypt is in fact in upper northern Africa. So when they speak, you hear them imply that they are not of African descent. And I, of course, do not argue with that. And I don't care if they consider themselves black, white, or whatever they consider themselves to be. That is irrelevant to me. But what I do know is you really just have to pick up a map to verify where Egypt, formerly called Kemet, actually is in Africa. You can call yourself a dog and be a cat. I don't care. But we forget that someone decided long ago to call parts of Africa the Middle East. We know that Africa itself is divided and there are many countries within Africa. We don't ask why or who decided to do this often. It's just like the continents. Who decided we're going to separate it like this? We just simply accept it. That is, of course, if and unless you are a descendant of these Egyptians or these people that call themselves that currently occupy Upper Africa or Kemet, Egypt today. We are more comfortable saying Middle East. Why is that? Well, you already know why. No one ever seems to boldly challenge, speak of, and up to the current citizens of Egypt and remind them of their actual history and their status and their actual identities. And even let them know that some of their rhetoric is anti-black, it is anti-African, and they have an aversion to it. So it was posted that Kevin Hart's Egypt show canceled after the comedian reportedly made Afrocentric comments about the country's history. Imagine being in Africa and saying something about Africans building and doing things in the same country. Well, anyway, this was considered to be insulting to these Egyptians in Africa, the country called Egypt. Well, Kevin Hart was alleged to have said something like, are similar to. This is what some are saying that he said. He said, we must teach our children the true history of Black Africans when they were kings in Egypt, and not just the era of slavery that is cemented by education in America. Now, Hart was, they saying that he said this in December, and he asked the question, do you remember the time when we were kings? And he was also being criticized for investing in a company called Black Sands Entertainment, which it produces what they call afro-centric comic books and animated programs, amongst other merchandise. Who would be upset about that? Now, as I have stated before, I'll say it again. These detractors of the Black history, when it comes to Egypt in that particular area of Africa, as it relates to Egypt or Kemet, they are detractors, but they cannot tell us why, if you're on a Black continent in a Black country, why wouldn't there be African history? Egypt does not dissipate its African origins, nor even simply by labeling itself the Middle East. You can't remove the fact that it is still Upper or Northern Africa. But most of these modern Egyptians today prefer being referred to as Middle Easterners. They say, we're from the Mediterranean. Okay, we got people here that are from those areas too. But these are not the original people of this continent either. So the reason why they do it, Egyptians like preferring to be to the ones today, like referring to themselves as Middle Easterners, is mainly because they identify ethnically as Arabs. And many illogical Egyptians see attempts to center Egyptian history on Black Africans. They like to call it afro-centrism, or blackwashing their history. That's kind of funny when you think about it and you analyze it. If you are in Africa, you are automatically a part of Black history, be it good history or bad history. Now, how you got onto the continent and found yourself in the particular location that you are in is a whole nother story that we should be talking about. That is the issue here. It's like the Caucasians in South Africa claiming it for themselves. You are not the original inhabitants of that land. So being offended about the truth of its history really makes no sense. No matter how many years or centuries that you have occupied it, it had a history before you became the occupier of that land. Its existence, our people were here before you came and conquered it, before you killed them off or did whatever you did to the original inhabitants. It was there before you came. There were people. So you can claim it, but it would be like the Caucasians here in America denying the existence of people when they came and conquered it. Nevertheless, this is a common response, and I am so glad that not only I, but Dr. Umar chose to speak on it and about this issue. Let's take a listen to what Dr. Umar has to say in regards to this issue. Take a listen.
Europeans cannot admit that Africans built that civilization because it automatically invalidates. It automatically invalidates their false claim to intellectual, cultural, and historical superiority. In addition to that, we know that Herodotus, Epictetus, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, all of the fathers of European intellectual culture, the Greco-Roman philosophers, they all came and studied at the feet of our grand master teacher ancestors in Kemet. The reason the white man can never admit that Kemet was a black African civilization is because it undoes and renders false most of the intellectual and cultural assumptions that he has taught and put into his textbooks. He cannot do it. This is why they don't support critical race theory. This is why they don't teach African history. This is why they don't want to teach the truth of racism or slavery, because the European intellectual heritage is very, very weak. It's not a theory, it is a fact that ancient Egyptian civilization was an African civilization. First of all, the Kemetic civilization was a civilization that grew out of earlier civilizations that predated and that were deeper into Africa. So we find before the rise of the first pharaoh in Kemet, there was a group of 12 pharaohs who reigned in Nubia prior to Kemet. We know that there were kings in Ethiopia prior to Egypt. So Egypt is a child of the earlier Nile Valley cultures that preceded it, all of which come from the heart of Africa, all of which are undeniably African. Egypt was, we're talking traditional Egypt, Kemetic Egypt, was African in its language, African in its culture, African in its spirituality, African in its social systems. Everything about Kemet was black. And if you don't want to believe the black people, go to the Greco-Roman philosophers who came to Egypt, who studied in Egypt. They said it was a black civilization. They said the people were blue, black, purple. The reason they called it Kemet, because Kemet meant land of the blacks. Okay, Europeans tried to say they were talking about the soil. Nonsense, because if that's the case, every land on earth would be called a Kemet, because there's black soil all over the globe. That had nothing to do with it. It was the people. So if you study the Greco-Roman philosophers, you will see clearly out of their own testimony, they met the Kemites. They met them. They studied under them. They lived with them. And they described them as undeniably black. The problem with the Arabs is they don't want people being reminded that they only took North Africa by way of the sword and conquest after the death of Muhammad ibn Abdullah, the prophet of Islam, who actually stopped or forbade the invasion of the Arabs into Africa. He actually forbade it. After he died, that's when the Arabs finally went into North Africa with violence, with aggression, with the sword, where they basically demanded that you will become Muslim or you will get your head cut off. And so the Arabs, who were very, very efficient in combat at that time, because all of the great dynasties, and especially the great warrior dynasties of ancient Kemet, they had already fallen. Egypt's golden age was over before Napoleon came and before the Arabs came. Okay, before Alexander the Great came. Okay, the great age of Africa was over as far as Nile Valley culture was concerned. So the Arabs came, they took North Africa with the sword and their religion, and they decimated the traditional African culture that was there. And so Egypt is only Arab, North Africa is only Arab by way of invasion. Period. Kevin Hart was absolutely right. There were no Arabs in that part of Africa at that time. The Arabs are not an ancient people to begin with. You understand? So there's no way they could have built the pyramids. And then they also try to steal a lot of other African accomplishments by claiming, you know, they'll talk about Muslim scientists and Muslim mathematicians and Muslim this, but what they don't tell you is those Muslims they're claiming were Africans of the Islamic faith. You see, they'll say Muslim to make you think it was Arabs who did this. You see, so for example, the numbers 0 through 9, those are called Arabic numbers. Those are not Arabic numbers. The number 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 is found, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know if it's the Great Pyramid or the Step Pyramid, but in one of the pyramids of Kemet, they found those numbers there. And they have also found those numbers in other places. So the Arabs did not give us the number system. Africans gave us the number system. But again, when people come in and invade your homeland, they lay claim to your inventions and creations.
Exactly.
Because they now own it all. Yes, sir. So the fact that they're upset with Kevin Hart for stating something that is an obvious truth, that's not even debatable anymore. Yeah, you'll find some white scholars who can accept the truth of the African dominance of the ancient world. You know, you'll find a couple of scholars here and there, but overall, my brother, we have already had that debate, and we have already won that debate a million times over. It's not even a debate no more. It's just the fact that the Arabs are a racist people, mostly. They do not like Africans. They are trading black people into slavery as we speak right now in East Africa, and they simply don't want to admit that they did not build that civilization. They are only in Africa by way of military conquest. This is well documented. It is not a myth. It is not a theory. The evidence is there. The written record of the conquest is there, even by Africans who lived at the time of the Arab conquest. And you know, the Arabs at one time were thinking about destroying the antiquities of ancient Kemet. A couple of years ago, this probably was about, and it comes up ever so often because in the religion of Islam, there's no images. They don't believe that God would allow man, that God would want man to have images. Of course, as African people, we completely disagree with that. Okay, you can have an image and not worship it. Okay, but ever so often, this idea of destroying the ancient antiquities of Kemet comes up in debate within the Arab government, within the government of Egypt, because they say, we Muslim. We don't believe in statues and we don't believe in images of great kings and queens. So we should destroy all of this. And it has come up several times. So the question I'm making, if the Arabs built the antiquities of Kemet, why would you want to destroy it? If you didn't build it. And the only reason why they haven't destroyed them, my brother, and I'm glad they haven't, is because tourism is one of the biggest businesses in Egypt. If you cut tourism out, if you destroy them antiquities, there is no tourism. Most people go to Egypt to see the pyramids. They do not go to Egypt to learn about Arabs. They go to Egypt to learn about traditional African high culture and civilization. So if the Arab destroys the ancient antiquities that our ancestors built along the Nile, you know how much money they would lose? You know how much revenue they would lose from tourism if they did that. So that's why they won't do it, because it's not in their financial interest to do it. But if it was not about money, I think those antiquities would have been destroyed a long time ago. About it, every pyramid was built before the Arabs invaded Africa. Every statue, every ancient town, every shrine, every temple was built before the Arabs came in with the swords, I believe at the end of the 5th and beginning of the 6th century, after the death. Muhammad ibn Abdullah died in 632, I want to say 570 to 632, they came in. So yeah, that's like the 7th century then. It's indisputable that the Arabs had nothing to do with the building of the antiquities in ancient Kemet. Europeans are not an ancient people. Let me say this again. Europeans are not an ancient people. They don't go back as far as you go back. Okay? The Iliad and the Odyssey written by Homer are some of the earliest evidence of European intellectual history. Okay? 1000 BC is when we really start to see European intellectual culture. 1000 years before Christ, that is not a long time. That is not a long time. And although there is evidence of European intellectual culture before then, it's not much compared to the plethora of African intellectual culture, which is why Europeans use the word classical. When you are in history class, they talk about classical European civilization, classical European intellectual heritage, classical European art. You don't hear them talk about ancient Europe. There's no ancient Europe. There's no ancient Greece, no ancient Rome. No, they're not an ancient people. They don't go back that far.
Facts.
They are the babies.
Johnny
They
come
are
lately.
the babies of the human race. And this is why white supremacy is so ruthless. This is why they burn the books. This is why they don't let certain texts in colleges and in public schools, because they understand that their claim to intellectual superiority is held together by the thinnest of evidence. The white man's propaganda is his greatest weapon, and everybody who has come in contact with it has become his slave.
Wow, very well spoken, Dr. Umar. Thank you, thank you. Like him or love him, he spoke undeniable truth in regards to this issue. You just can't whitewash the truth of Egypt in Africa and Black African or Black people's influence on the world. Now, tell me what you think about this topic. Subscribe and leave me your thoughts on this particular conversation. And I will see you next time for a daily discussion with Dina. Ta ta!
This concludes your daily discussions with Dina. Join us Monday through Friday at 12:30 p.m. Like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment.